James and his college friend Marcus both turned 32 the same year. Both earned around $75,000 and both had $65,000 sitting in savings. They were renting nearly identical apartments 3 blocks apart in the same city. James bought a house. Marcus kept renting and invested the difference. 20 years later, both men are financially comfortable, and the honest comparison between their two paths is far more interesting and far closer than either side of the rent versus buy debate typically admits. The homeownership argument usually leads with the ending, "Look what the house is worth now." The renting argument usually leads with flexibility and pretends that flexibility has no long-term cost. Neither version runs the complete math. This video runs the complete math. The closing costs nobody mentions until the table, the interest-heavy early mortgage years, the maintenance budget that never makes it onto a real estate thumbnail, and the number almost nobody calculates honestly. What actually happens if the renter genuinely invests the difference for 2 decades straight? The starting point: 2 identical people, 2 different moves. James found a 3-bedroom home listed at $320,000. He put down the full $65,000, just over 20%, avoiding private mortgage insurance, and financed the remainder on a 30-year loan at 7%. His principal and interest payment came to approximately $1,700 monthly. Add property taxes near $320, insurance around $140, and a maintenance reserve of roughly $270, 1% of the home's value annually, the minimum any honest planner recommends, and James's full monthly housing cost landed close to $2,400. Marcus signed a new lease on a comparable 3-bedroom for $1,900 monthly. He took his $65,000 and placed it into a total market index fund and committed to investing the roughly $500 monthly gap between his rent and James's full housing cost. On paper, in month 1, Marcus looked like he had found a clever shortcut, living in an equivalent home for less, with his capital still working in the market. The part nobody says out loud at closing. Here is what almost never gets mentioned honestly in this debate. The moment James signed his closing paperwork, he was not ahead. He was behind, and not by a small amount. Closing costs on a home in this price range typically run between 2 and 5% of the purchase price. Lender fees, title insurance, attorney costs, prepaid taxes, escrow setup. James's true day-one cost was closer to $75,000 to $80,000 rather than the $65,000 he handed over as a down payment. That gap has to be recovered through appreciation and equity building before homeownership starts to outperform renting in any honest comparison. It is real, it is standard, and it rarely appears in the simplified version of this argument. There's a second piece almost nobody explains clearly. In the early years of a mortgage, the overwhelming majority of each payment is interest, not equity. Of James's roughly $1,700 monthly payment in year 1, close to $1,500 of it went directly to the lender as interest. Only around $200 actually reduced his loan balance. Add taxes, insurance, and maintenance, and James was sending close to $2,400 monthly out the door, with only a small fraction of it building anything he could call equity. The phrase, "renting is throwing money away," survives because it sounds intuitively true. But in year 1, James was effectively throwing away more money on non-equity costs than Marcus was spending on rent entirely. Year 3, where the spreadsheet starts talking back. By year 3, James had paid roughly $86,000 in total housing costs. Of that, approximately $7,600 had gone toward actual principal reduction. His remaining mortgage balance sat near $248,000. Assuming modest annual appreciation in the 3 to 4% range, his home was now worth somewhere between $350,000 and $360,000, putting his equity in the range of $100,000 to $112,000. That is genuine wealth. It is also entirely illiquid, locked inside a structure James cannot access without selling and absorbing a meaningful commission or borrowing against it at a new interest rate. Marcus, over the same 3 years, had paid roughly $68,000 in rent. His original $65,000 investment had grown to approximately $86,000 at historical average returns. His ongoing monthly contributions added another $23,000 or so in portfolio value. Marcus's total invested wealth at year 3 sat close to $109,000, slightly ahead of James's equity position, and fully liquid, accessible without selling anything or taking on new debt. The costs the buying side conveniently skips. A genuinely honest comparison has to include several categories that homeownership advocates routinely leave out of the pitch. Transaction costs on the back end are significant. When James eventually sells, a typical seller's commission runs 5 to 6% of the sale price. Combined with what he paid going in, the full transaction drag across a complete buy and sell cycle often reaches 8 to 10% of the home's value, a hurdle that appreciation has to clear before the purchase genuinely outperforms the alternative. Property taxes rise with assessed value. As James's home appreciates, his tax bill climbs alongside it, meaning his total housing cost is not actually as fixed as the mortgage payment alone suggests. Marcus's rent will also rise over time, but the property tax exposure belongs entirely to his landlord, not to him. Maintenance is not optional and rarely matches the budgeted average in any given year. Some years look like $200 in light bulbs and caulk. Other years look like an $8,000 roof, a $6,000 HVAC replacement, or a foundation issue that arrives without warning. These costs are guaranteed across a long enough timeline. Skipping the reserve for them is not saving money. It is deferring a bill that arrives eventually on its own schedule. And the opportunity cost of the down payment itself almost never appears in homeownership math. James's $65,000, removed from the market the moment it was wired to closing, would have grown to roughly $430,000 over 20 years at typical historical market returns had it stayed invested instead. That is not money James lost. It is the alternative path he traded for home equity. And any honest comparison has to weigh both sides of that trade. Year 10, the picture shifts. By year 10, James's home was worth somewhere between $430,000 and $450,000. His mortgage balance had fallen to roughly $220,000. His equity sat between $210,000 and $230,000. Total out-of-pocket costs across the decade, down payment, closing costs, and everything above the principal portion of his payments landed somewhere between $140,000 and $165,000. Marcus's portfolio had grown substantially. His original investment plus a decade of monthly contributions, which had grown smaller in relative terms as his rent climbed roughly 3% annually, narrowing the cost gap between his situation and James's, had compounded to approximately $260,000. On pure liquid net worth, Marcus remained slightly ahead. But something important had shifted by this point. Marcus's rent had climbed to nearly $2,400 monthly, closing in on what James was paying, except James's payment was fixed for another 2 decades, while Marcus's rent had no ceiling in sight. Year 20, the gap that matters most. By year 20, James's home was worth approximately $600,000 to $630,000. His mortgage balance had dropped to around $170,000. His equity stood between $430,000 and $460,000. Across 2 decades, he had spent somewhere between $50,000 and $70,000 total on maintenance, a real cost, but manageable against the equity built. Marcus's portfolio, after 20 years of compounding and contributions that had shrunk in relative size as his rent absorbed more of his monthly budget, sat in the range of $490,000 to $520,000. His rent by this point had climbed to roughly $3,200 monthly. At this stage, the two men's net worth figures are genuinely close, Marcus slightly ahead on paper, James close behind in equity. But James has something Marcus does not, an end date. In 10 more years, his mortgage is paid in full. At year 30, James owns his home outright, worth perhaps $800,000, with monthly housing costs dropping to just taxes, insurance, and maintenance, somewhere around $800 to $1,000 monthly. Marcus, at year 30, is still renting, paying somewhere near $4,300 to $4,600 monthly, with no asset underneath the payment and no floor on how high it might eventually climb. The assumption that makes or breaks the renting strategy. Here is the detail that changes this entire comparison more than any other factor. The rent and invest strategy only works if the difference is actually invested consistently every single month, including the months when markets fall sharply and every instinct says to hold cash instead. Every analysis showing renting outperforming buying assumes perfect investment discipline from the renter. The data on whether people actually maintain that discipline in real life is not encouraging. Many people spend the gap instead: a nicer apartment, a better car, a more comfortable lifestyle that quietly absorbs the savings before they ever reach a brokerage account. The mortgage payment, by contrast, enforces savings automatically and without requiring ongoing willpower. That forced discipline has real value that no spreadsheet captures on its own, and it is a significant part of why home ownership tends to build wealth for average households more reliably than the pure theoretical math would predict. Being honest about the downsides of buying, too. The break-even timeline on buying is longer than most new buyers expect. Once closing costs, selling costs, and the interest-heavy early mortgage years are all accounted for, buying typically does not outperform renting and investing until somewhere between year 5 and year 7 in a normal market. Buy a home and sell within 3 years, and there is a genuine possibility of coming out behind compared to renting the same period. Concentration risk is real and frequently underappreciated. A homeowner whose largest asset is tied to a single property in a single market carries risk that a diversified investor simply does not. Markets that stagnate or decline can leave a homeowner's primary asset underwater for years, with no easy way to rebalance the way an investor can. And liquidity matters more than people expect until they actually need it. A homeowner cannot sell 5% of their house to cover an emergency. Accessing home equity requires either selling or borrowing against it at a new rate, neither of which is instant and both of which carry costs. Buying tends to win clearly for people planning to stay in one place at least 7 to 10 years, in markets where the price-to-rent ratio is favorable and where local appreciation trends support the leverage a mortgage provides. Renting tends to win clearly for people who may relocate within 3 to 5 years in markets where rents remain modest relative to purchase prices, and specifically for anyone who can genuinely maintain the investment discipline the renting strategy requires without letting the saved difference quietly disappear into lifestyle spending. James and Marcus are both in strong financial positions today, 20 years into two very different paths. The real question this comparison answers is not which strategy wins in the abstract. It is two much more personal questions. How long do you actually plan to stay? And if you choose to rent, will you genuinely invest the difference every single month, including the difficult ones? Everything else in this entire analysis flows from honest answers to those two questions.